Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm gonna be testing Cyberpunk 2077 version 2.02 with the Phantom Liberty DLC as well in the GeForce GTX 1060 6GB model, the Beast mid-range GPU from 2016, as well as its nemesis, the Radeon RX 580 8GB model that came out a year later, and it also competed for a long time with the GTX 1060, of course. Let's find out how they run this new version of Cyberpunk, shall we? Alright, first up, let's take a look at the GPU specs side by side. You can't really directly compare everything, like the shaders, for example. The RX 580 has a lot more shaders than the GTX 1060 does, but of course these are totally different architectures from different brands as well. And now moving on to the test system, we are pairing these cards with an i5-13600K overclocked to 5.5 GHz, 32 GB of DDR5 RAM in dual channel, 6000 MHz CL36, and a 2 TB SSD where the game is installed, as well as a 512 GB SSD for Windows 11 Pro. We're also using a 750 watt PSU from Corsair. It's the RM750i, and I know this is a totally overkill system for the GPUs that we're testing here today, but that doesn't really matter. As long as you don't bottleneck them, you will get the same FPS with a much weaker CPU and less RAM as well. So let's get into the game now. So I'm gonna be playing here at 1080p resolution using the low settings preset with medium textures on both cards. No FSR first, so this is native resolution, and I'm starting with the GTX 1060. The low settings preset sets a lot of things to medium, as you can see, so it's not the lowest settings in the game, and it still looks really good. By the way, I will also utilize the Steam Deck settings a little bit later, and I will do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison with the built-in benchmark in this game at the end of the video. But right now, I'm just seeing the experience here, moving the camera around, playing the game, killing Bob, obviously, both in the base game as well as in the DLC a little bit later, okay? So it's gonna be quite a big video, the usual gameplay stuff from me, and then a little comparison at the end. I believe the 580 might do a little bit better of a job here in Cyberpunk. I don't know, at least people say that GPU or AMD GPUs in general age a little bit better, so that's gonna be interesting to check out. Goodbye, Bob! There we go! I didn't know Bob was Chinese. He actually talked a little bit there in a Chinese language. Maybe it wasn't Chinese, I don't know. Maybe it was Japanese. So this is one of the most intensive areas in the base game. It's not the most, okay, but it's really, really intensive, and it drops things into the low 40s. Did it actually drop from 30? I don't think so. Yeah, it just gets down to 40 frames per second flat, and it does not drop from 30 FPS. So that's a pretty decent experience for a GTX 1060. Once again, we're not playing on the absolute lowest settings. The game still looks really, really good here on the low preset, and it's getting 43 FPS on average with 37 1% lows, and the 1% lows didn't really drop that far, you know. Also, VRAM utilization is around 4 GB here at 1080p low settings with medium textures, so totally under control. And let's enable FSR on quality now and repeat the same test. I'm gonna load the game as well. Also, there is always gonna be a little bit of run-to-run variation in terms of the FPS average and 1% lows. Wow, FSR does make a huge difference here with the GTX 1060. Holy crap, we went from like 40 FPS to the 50s and touching 60 frames per second as well. That's pretty impressive. Nice. Okay, it also looks alright. You know, you can see some things are a little bit more shimmery and pixelated, but I think on a 1080p monitor it will look pretty decent. And you know what? I think I would actually end up playing like this with a GTX 1060 6GB. It's a decent experience. I don't really require 60 plus 100% of the time, and once you stop driving, by the way, if you're just walking around shooting people, it's a little bit less intensive, and it should stay at 60 plus. So let's kill Bob once again. There we go. Goodbye, Bob. He didn't die, guys. He didn't die, but it doesn't matter. As I told you, there is going to be a little bit of run-to-run variance in terms of averages and 1% lows, but it's not really to the point where it matters, you know. It's going to get very, very similar results every single time. I'm going to drive around this roundabout just a couple more times because I did that previously, and it's a very intensive area, as I told you. Drops down to like 54 frames per second minimum. from what I saw. Yeah, 53 right there. Not bad, with a little bit of an overclock, which I am not doing in this video for obvious reasons. All cards overclock differently. I could have, for example, a very decent overclocker on a GTX 1060 and a poor one on the RX 580. I don't know, so I kept them at the default values. All right, at the end we got 57 FPS average and 47 1% lows. The 1% lows were better than the averages previously from no FSR. That's really good, guys. Let's go over to the actual DLC of the game. Okay, here we go. I have disabled FSR2 at the moment, so we're back to native resolution, and let's do this. The DLC is way more intensive than the base game. As you can clearly see, we're already in the 30s, and previously, maybe we dipped into like the 39, 38 range, but not from it. You know, it's actually dropping right now into the low 30s. That is insane, guys. It's kind of crazy how much more intensive at least this area of the DLC really is. 30 FPS starts feeling really choppy, and since this game has the first-person aspect to it, I wouldn't go with a 30 FPS experience. But that's just me. If you want to lock it to 30 FPS, I guess it's going to be possible, because the 1% lows are at 30 right there. It didn't really drop. It also doesn't stutter, which is nice to see. It stuttered a lot on my Asus ROG Ally, for example, right here on the DLC, and it was a terrible experience. It wasn't playable at all, okay, even at 720p lowest settings. But here with GTX 1060, provided you have the CPU power and the RAM as well, it is gonna work absolutely fine. Also, VRAM usage is a little bit higher than in the base game, but still very much under control. 6 GB are definitely enough. Now let's use quality FSR and see if things can improve to a point where... Oh yeah, okay, where I would choose to play like this instead of like lowering resolution. I think so. It's getting 40 plus FPS all of the time right now. Yeah, it doesn't even drop from 40 frames. That's really good compared to what we've seen. It actually dipped to 39 right there for a second, but not a problem. Okay, so this is a very similar experience to what we saw in the base game without FSR 3 or 2 enabled. Sorry, it's FSR 2.1, not 3. Around here we can even get close to the 50s sometimes. Okay, yeah, 47 right there, not bad. Averages and 1% lows are super similar to the non-FSR run in the base title. It's really, really weird, okay? It's so interesting how much more intensive this really is with the DLC. Damn. But hey, at least you can play it with a GTX 1060, you can expect a few less FPS, and this is the Dogtown part, by the way, of the DLC. The entire map isn't this, alright? This is just the most intensive part of it. Okay, let's test the Steam Deck preset this time around with high textures. Balanced FSR is set by default, but I'm gonna disable it, play at native resolution first, and I'm also gonna disable the motion blur right here. Everything else, I'll leave it as is. A lot of things are now on high and on medium as well. Okay, I'm gonna start counting our FPS. Let's do this. Hopefully it's not gonna drop from 30, but it might. It actually might, especially in the DLC, guys. It is not gonna run very well in the DLC, I can tell you that right away. You can probably see that there isn't really that big of a difference comparing the low preset to the Steam Deck preset, or like low to medium settings and medium to high settings, right? It's very, very similar looking. I mean, some reflections look better, some shadows as well, the lighting, but it's pretty minor. If you're not really pixel peeping and stuff like that, you can't really tell much of a difference. Now, it's not really dropping right here, which I find very impressive. Once again, I thought it would drop into the low 30s there, but it didn't. I actually thought it was gonna do a little bit worse without any FSR enabled. But now, let's try it with some FSR. 37 FPS on average, 31, 1% low is what we got. Let's set it to quality. The car still has a bit of ghosting. It's noticeable in lighter conditions, but it's not too ridiculous. Maybe because the microphone is in front of it. But yeah, if you care about ghosting, definitely disable FSR2, I guess. Goodbye, Bob! Once again, there we go. Don't rub me. That wasn't a rub, Bob. How are you still alive? Jesus. Anyway, around here it's dropping into the mid-40s, I guess, and high 40s as well. That is pretty impressive, guys. Whoa. 50 FPS average is what we get now. From 37 to 50. That's a way better experience with FSR. Time for the DLC, guys. Oh, it's dropping into the 20s. Damn. Okay, so that is not playable. Oof. It actually stays in the 20s very often. Oh, boy. Right. VRAM usage is going up as well, guys. Look at that. 5.8 gigs right there, although it's not terrible, you know, it's not really stuttering because we're running out of VRAM or anything, it's fine. So it makes us have a 31 FPS average in the 26, 1% low. That is not good. Hopefully, quality FSR is gonna fix everything for us once again, and it does. We're getting very similar FPS to what we saw previously on low preset and native resolution. Even better, actually, right now. 38. It's not really dipping into the lower 30s very often. But yeah, 40 FPS coming from 31. Jesus, stop hitting things, Crisp. Oh boy. Coming from 31 FPS, this feels way better, guys. Like, it is a night and day difference. We're getting 1% lows above our averages without FSR. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? And that's it for the results of the GTX 1060 here in Cyberpunk 2077. Let's install the RX 580 and see the gameplay experience on this card. Alright guys, here we have it. RX 580 is installed. Let's go over the settings again. 1080p using low settings with medium textures, exactly the same as we started with the GTX 1060. And of course, I'm gonna test all of the settings all over again. Alright guys, here we go. Let's start counting our FPS. The 1060 got 43 FPS average and 37.1% lows after our little benchmark run over here. This one's already touching 50-something FPS. Not sure if the 1060 did that, actually. I think it was a little bit slower than this one, wasn't it? But of course, we gotta go to the most intensive area first to actually compare things. And again, if you want a one-to-one comparison without any benchmark variation and stuff, because sometimes I crash into things, I can kill Bob differently and so on. By the end of the video, I will have a side-by-side comparison once again. Let's kill Bob. That was a really bad attempt at killing Bob. But he almost died, so goodbye, Bob. See you in the next run. Okay, so drive around the roundabout once again for about like 3 times, same as GTX 1060. It's dropping into the mid-40s. 1060 dropped into the low 40s, right? Like it touched 40 frames per second. This is considerably faster than GTX 1060, guys. It's a bit of a shame, though, that the 580 is gonna stop receiving driver support a lot sooner than the GTX 1060, guys, because it's apparently is still a pretty decent card, even for Cyberpunk here at native resolution, low settings preset, which look great, of course. Damn, I wasn't expecting it to be so much better here. All right, now we're playing with exactly the same settings, but with quality FSR this time around, of course. And the 1060 got, wow, this is already above 60 FPS at the beginning. Nice, dude. This is probably gonna get 60 on average. That's awesome. But again, the 1060 got 57 FPS on average and 47.1% lows with these settings that we're utilizing right now, and FSR on quality. I really hope to see 60 FPS, guys, on that average, but I don't think it's gonna happen because it's consistently below it, at least in these areas. Goodbye, Bob, once again. Okay, now we did it, my friends. Bob is officially dead. Nice. RX 580 is doing a great job, indeed. 59 FPS average. Yep, Bob is definitely dead. You know what? I'm gonna drive around the roundabout for a couple of more times again, because we did that with the GTX 1060. Alright, all good here. So far, so good. It's not even dropping into the lower 50s around here. That's nice. So this one, with a bit of an overclock over the factory EOC that we've got going on, it would definitely achieve 60 FPS on average and more, actually, and possibly stay above 60 for most of the time here in the base game at least, because around these areas it's usually at like 58, 59 frames per second. Time for the Phantom Liberty DLC 1080p using the low settings again with medium textures and no FSR first. So we're getting 30s already, but I feel like this is quite a bit better once again than the GTX 1060 did. Let me check out the results with the 1060 real quick here. 36 and 30. This one is... Oh, whoa! Whoa! Okay, this one is gonna need to be restarted. That's what's happening. Okay, so the 1% lows, at the moment at least, are pretty much the same as the averages were with the GTX 1060. And although it's not really, again, a night and day difference, it can make a little bit of a difference, especially with Steam Deck settings. This one might actually not even drop from 30 FPS when we're using those settings in the DLC, whereas the 1060 dropped into the high 20s quite often. And then it's gonna be quite a big difference in terms of the experience, because once it drops into the 20s, you can notice it right away, even if it's only like a couple of FPS. Alright, so at the end of it, we got 42 on average and 35 1% lows. That's wow. Okay, back at it again. 1080p quality FSR this time and the low settings preset, and start counting our FPS. I'm also noticing that in the DLC, I'm not seeing those little spikes that we were seeing in the base game. And mind you, I did restart the game previously a couple of times. Well, we got one of them right there. So I don't know what was going on with those little stutters. Again, they weren't really too noticeable, so they're not even worth bothering with. They didn't even lower our 1% lows, but over here in the DLC, which is much more intensive, it's not getting those. 51 FPS on average so far. The 1060 got 46 average and 47 1% lows. No, 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 no! Please don't get stuck. Oh, god damn it. I gotta restart this again. As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by this car over there, the 1060 got 46 FPS average. Damn it. Don't drive while looking at your phone, that's what happens, okay? And 37 1% lows. This is, once again, quite a big difference. 51 FPS average and 42 1% lows. Not reaching like the averages of the 1060 on the 1%, but it's a little bit smoother. I can actually notice it slightly, okay? It's like 15% better experience. Back to the options menu, 1080p resolution, Steam Deck settings, and I'm gonna disable FSR, of course, as well as the motion blur, and leave everything else as is. Let's do this, guys. Hitting 40 FPS already with the Steam Deck settings. Let's see if it stutters, actually, because right now I'm not seeing any frame time variations there, like we saw the first run. This feels playable for sure compared to the 1060 that got 37 FPS average and 31 1% lows. I guess we're in for another result where the RX 570's 1% lows reach the averages of the 1060. That's crazy. That's pretty crazy, and something that I actually didn't expect coming into this. I thought the 1060 was still doing a pretty decent job for what it is, you know, of course, not counting with the latest and greatest title, well, latest not greatest titles, right? Because they're all broken and super intensive on even the newest hardware. But yeah, games from 2020 and older still run very well on the RX 580 and GTX 1060. I just thought they were closer together than they actually are, at least in Cyberpunk. 40 FPS on average right now. 34 1% lows. So although the 1% lows aren't really reaching the 37 that the other one got on average, they're pretty close. And 40 FPS is definitely much smoother. Let's enable FSR on quality. Also, I didn't pay too much attention to the VRAM utilization, but I guess it's to around like 5.2 gigabytes, so very similar to the GTX 1060 as well, at least here on the base game. Let's go. 53 FPS so far, pretty good. No stuttering to speak of at all. It's pretty nice, guys, and smooth and playable. I really enjoy this. I think, again, with a little bit of an OC, it could reach closer to 60 FPS on average. Pretty similar to what we saw previously on low settings, you know, with like 58 on average or so. 1% lows at 45, average at 53. 1060 got 50 FPS average and 43 1% lows. This one so far is getting 53 on average and 45 1% lows. Much closer experience with FSR compared to no FSR. I guess maybe the GTX 1060 runs a little bit better or scales a little bit better with lower resolutions than the RX 580 does. Because what FSR quality is doing is basically it's rendering the game at 720p and then upscaling it to 1080p res. And that's it, 53 FPS on average, 45 1% lows, Steam Deck settings, FSR, runs pretty well. It's DLC time, no FSR at the moment, using the same Steam Deck settings, or medium to high basically. And okay, this is where the GTX 1060 dropped from 30 FPS quite often as well. And the 580 is holding in there, so far at least, look at that. Okay, it's like 2 to 5 more FPS, yeah? I think that's it. That's quite a big difference. Once again, in pretty much every single title out there, 30 plus FPS makes a huge difference. And the moment you drop from 30 FPS even like to 28, I would drop the settings instantly, okay? So with the GTX 1060, I wouldn't say that this is a playable experience, but with the RX 588GB, it is really playable. But now with quality FSR 2.1, things will be much smoother, of course, and this is probably, again, how I'd play the game. Unless you really hate upscalers, I highly recommend you to do this, because it will look very similar. You can tell the difference, it's more shimmery and so on. But it looks decent enough still, and you get way higher FPS. In this case, we're now in the 40s instead of in the 30s, so we're getting like 10 more frames per second than what we got previously, which makes it a little bit more comfortable, especially if you don't lock your FPS. It definitely feels a little bit better. Back in the days when I didn't know anything about FPS and I just started discovering what FPS meant and what 30, 40, 50, 60 FPS felt like, I thought 40 FPS was the best experience ever. So little 12 or 13-year-old me would definitely enjoy this a lot more with 45 FPS on average than with 30-ish FPS on average. So there's that. And compared to the GTX 1060 that got 40 FPS on average in 32 1% lows, so this is, once again, like 10 to 15% better than that card in this particular area. And lastly, let's take a look at the side-by-side comparison. This was taken at 1080p resolution with the low settings preset and medium textures, the first settings that I tested with each GPU. And I'm fast-forwarding it a little bit here so we get to the end results a bit quicker, you know. And my results using MSI Afterburner and Rivet Tuner with the averages and 1% lows showed 47 FPS average with 34 1% lows for the GTX 1060 and 54 FPS average with 41 1% lows for the RX 580. That differs slightly from the results that we got with the built-in tool, especially on the minimum side of things. I don't know where those 32 minimum came from with the RX 580, but going by my results, we got a 15% higher average with the RX 580 and a 20% higher 1% low on the 580 as well compared to the GTX 1060. And finally, it's conclusion time. The 580 was quite a bit faster than the GTX 1060, guys. I wasn't really expecting that much of a difference. It was 15% faster in pretty much every scenario that we tested here today. And as you could probably tell, both of these GPUs did a pretty decent job. The game was definitely playable on both of them. It's also pretty interesting that the Phantom Liberty DLC asks for a GTX 1066GB and an RX 588GB for the minimum requirements. So that's exactly what we tested here. And that's been it for this one. Thank you very much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, let me know what you thought of this new format, testing a game in a couple of GPUs, comparing them a little bit. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Do you prefer me to test a single GPU with many more settings or not? Comment down below so I know your opinions, and I'll catch you in the next one very soon. Love you all. Bye-bye.